So I've met Lorenzo lots of times through the cooperative movement in Edinburgh. Something I think is super important for us to think about ways of cooperating rather than just competing. So the network of one of the principles of the 7 principles of cooperation, international principles, is to work with other cooperatives. And so I was really pleased to invite Lorenzo as one of the probably one of the longer residents because of being fortunate to be living there as a postgraduate student undertaking a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And so I'm grateful to Lorenzo for coming along this evening when he's just about to try and submit his thesis. And so this is extra to the call of duty. So thank you, Lorenzo. I'll pass over to you. You can speak for 15, 20 minutes or so, just to give us a bit of a picture of, if you want to make it less, that's fine. And then we'll just take questions and answers. I've already explained the challenge the cohort of those graduating this year face. And what we're trying to explore a little bit is how can we get more cooperatives going? And because I know that's a question you've asked frequently. Lorenzo, are you able to share your screen now?
Let me try. I mean, I think so. I'm on a friend's laptop actually, so it might take a little bit for me to actually get my slides on this. So I'm still kind of trying to work through the links, but I can start talking, and then hopefully at some point technology will cooperate with us and we'll get things. I haven't actually. So I don't really have slides actually. I've kind of come up with this bit of a mind map because I think this is a problem that is not very linear. We can't just, I'm not going to give you like a story from beginning to end. I think there's a lot of different angles to this issue that, we can explore. And, I'm happy to make this as interactive as people want. I don't really want to necessarily talk for a long period of time. So if people want to come in with any comments, that'd be great. But basically, just a bit of an introduction. As David kindly introduced me, I've been staying at the co-op for about 4 years. And during this time, I spent the last year or so as the property developer, which within our co-op is kind of like the role that's tasked with thinking a little bit about, the future of our co-op and how to expand into multiple buildings. And so as part of this role, I spent a lot of time, doing lots of different things, really, including going to meetings like this, but also just looking at real estate websites and, trying to look at properties that I think would be suitable for a co-op. And actually, surprisingly, there's often some properties on the market that would actually make for really nice co-ops, either like, small co-ops or even medium ones. It's hard to find something of the same size as our current building, which is 106 beds. But, I've seen things come up between, 10 and 30 beds. And as I was doing this, I always think about, these buildings are going up and we don't really have, what I think I'm calling as co-op readiness almost, where, when the building comes up, we don't really have the organizational capacity to just say, yes, we're going to buy and move in. Part of it, I think, is like, I always say that there's these two issues of like land and money when you want to start a co-op, which are the main things that we have to deal with. But then as I'm getting closer to my graduation and starting to think about, okay, what's going to happen after, I'm done with my degree and I have to move out of this building. I think we also have a bit of a people problem in that it's very easy to sell co-ops to students just now. We do have this, huge housing crisis, and, there's some folks at Edinburgh Uni that have been doing some research, and apparently 9% of up to 9% of students are homeless at some point during their uni career. And so it's really easy to sell sell co-ops to students as a concept. But I've been thinking a little bit about what happens once you graduate and you know, you're trying to look for like, you know, more permanent housing. What's stopping us from getting people into co-ops? And this is kind of what I'm calling co-op readiness. So in a way, there is a pipeline problem of we might have people that at some point are interested in going into co-ops, and they do end up living here, and we get up to 30 people to graduate every year. So that's quite, you know, it should give us a critical mass of people that actually are interested in this and ready to take on co-ops, but we lose them at some point in the process. And so I'm trying to figure out why that's happening. And I think what I want to get out of you know, this conversation, and maybe not, obviously not just tonight, but one thing that we start thinking about in the future is how do we develop infrastructure where, you know, we have strong networks that, you know, actually manage to keep people inside the co-op movement. So when we have opportunities to acquire land, we have people that are ready for it. I don't recognize that link. London Cash. I guess that's it's for society and housing. Do you want to tell us a bit about Cash, Shannon? Or who shared this?
I did. I don't know if it's useful. But so Cash is a cooperative or cooperatives. I think they were set up 4 or 5 years ago, a few years before COVID. And basically, what they do is that they are looking at prospective sites within London, and they are also bringing co-ops together and doing things like raising loan stocks and trying to have some kind of finance available, so that when a site becomes available, actually there is just exactly what you're talking about. There is the kind of money and the readiness and the knowledge to actually be able and bid for those sites and those kind of things. So that may be something quite useful to connect with them, to understand how they.
Yeah. That's not that specific example I hadn't really come across. I was going to say, I mean, if eventually my slides come up or my mind map comes up, there is quite a lot of different groups that are trying to do this across the world and in the UK. But it does seem like we have a bit of a gap in Scotland just now. So again, no slides, so I don't have my figures here. But I was going to try to draw a few parallels between Scotland and the UK to some extent. And so actually looking at the data, I was just doing that today. And I'm actually quite shocked. We've lost 200 cooperatives in the UK in the last 5 years or 6 years. The figures that Co-op UK had, based in 2018, I think amounted to like 600 co-ops, and now it's closer to 475. And I think Scotland has about 34 co-ops just now. And most of them tend to be very small. So there's a bit of a mix, right? We have small co-ops that are a few, you know, maybe one household or a couple of households that have kind of come together and found a small property. And then we have this kind of like big institutional co-ops, right? Which are mostly our registered social landlords. And, you know, I'm going to try to make a clear distinction here. I think I'm not, you know, I think these large co-ops are better than housing associations in that tenants have nominal control. But I think most of the people here in this call are probably not super interested in that model because it doesn't really translate to this kind of like co-housing experience that we actually do like and seek from co-ops. So focusing mostly on the smaller stuff. If you, I had a nice map somewhere. Again, this is really frustrating. I don't know why. Sorry, I'm just gonna stop complaining about the technology, but eventually, I might try to see. I'm gonna restart the other computer while this is happening. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Where was I? Yes, so we have a lot of smaller co-ops and a few bigger co-ops, but in a way, the situation is a bit stagnant. We haven't really managed to successfully start new projects in quite a few years. So Glasgow Student Housing Coop has been looking for a house, for example, for 6 or 8 years now, and it's not a money problem because they actually did get a grant from ScotMid. It's kind of if the issue of like, no, the right property isn't quite coming up at the right time. So I think there's a few different problems that is worth exploring. One of it is legislation. There's a few things that are happening in Scotland. So England, surprisingly, actually has slightly more progressive legislation when it comes to starting a co-op, in that they don't have to pay the same amount of tax that we do up here when purchasing a property. So there's a few exceptions for them, and we've tried to get the Scottish government to grant us, to kind of like to get us to the same level ground when it comes to the law, and they've not been particularly responsive when it comes to that. There's one other issue, so that's kind of stopping people from buying more co-ops because it's more expensive. One model that I think has been quite successful somewhere in other places is established co-ops buying properties for new forming co-ops, which is something that we have been trying to do, but there's an extra difficulty there in that co-ops that don't own their buildings are required to pay for HMO, and that's kind of another step that's basically another obstacle. At the broader level, we see, and I think people in Cohousing Scotland have seen that a lot, there is a wider skepticism about the model. So people don't necessarily understand how it works, and why, who are the people that are trying to move into co-ops. So there is opposition at all level of government, from the local government to like national government, where people are, not necessarily going to tell us we don't think co-ops work, but they do say that it is harder to kick things off because we lack this kind of like institutional presence. So recently I was talking to someone who is trying to establish a small co-op in the Borders, and they had a lot of issues where the council was basically stopping them because they only really want to work with accredited developers to actually develop properties. And these are people that to some extent have had experience living in co-op. Cool. Yeah. So
Lorenzo, I wonder if you want to just pause and try and see if you can catch or transfer your slideshow. Is that possible to the laptop you've got?
I'm trying to reboot the laptop just now. Yeah, sorry, this is going to end up a bit more rambly than I intended without my material, but.
Or maybe you can, if you want, you could email it to me and I could display it, and then people could, then you can tell me to move on. If you just forward the slides to me, if it's easy.
I just don't have access to the file just now because my laptop is.
While Lorenzo is trying to focus on that, I'll just share also. It's great that Cecile has mentioned. If you want to focus on your tech problem, Lorenzo,
yes.
I'll just talk about another network which is called Radical Roots, which is a long-standing spin-off and community organization that is associated with a network called Diggers and Dreamers. So there's a long-standing publishing group called Diggers and Dreamers who published a very good and really very readable and very informative co-housing handbook, and have been working with the original communes from the 60s, 70s, and 80s and many other related cooperative housing arrangements. They're actually meeting, I think, next month as part of their annual regular annual gathering. Radical Roots does have provision for loaning money from co-ops who've paid off their loan, for instance, and therefore thereby are able to pass on some of the capital or lend out again the capital. So it could be, for those of us who are thinking about mainstream co-housing groups, it could be an association with Radical Roots, might be a mechanism which would assist those of us who haven't necessarily thought of cooperative form that they might be of assistance. So Lorenzo, are you any nearer to getting your?
Yes, I've almost got it. And yeah, thanks for introducing Radical Roots. It is part of the material I was going to share.
I just see popping up is Gloria has just asked to chip in. So as you say, Lorenzo, let's make it a conversation. Gloria, do you want to come in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wondered if people heard of the campaign Living Rent is currently doing. I'm just posting it on the chat just now. And it seems sort of, I know it's slightly tangential, sorry about that, but since Lorenzo's sorting out his file, but he already mentioned that, you know, what happens when you graduate and then, you know, you kind of start over. And at the same time, universities and places are building lots of student accommodations, and there's a lot of planning and other land exploitative land use acquiring by developers and so on, and there's almost like no stopping them kind of thing, and it's very capitalistic. What if I'm just asking the question, I suppose, what if all this student accommodation potential places were somehow enforced to be co-housing projects instead, and students and social housing and, you know, intergenerational living in, you know, put together, you know, then for example, people like Lorenzo won't have that jump to make when they graduate, for example, or other people will then have more integrated living, you know. I think some years back, before the student housing boom happened, you know, we all lived in tenant flats with the local people. And that's kind of now stopped because they're now all moved into these egg boxes. And, you know, it's unhealthy for the city, and it's a bit like another pocket that's just slightly different from Airbnbs. And how can we have a better model? And I think co-housing is such a much better model, surely. And it takes a lot of, I suppose, effort from councillors, planning committees, as it says in the link I sent, planning committees, MSPs, MPs, you know, all those people who are in power, as well as those who can help to, to make it happen, because the system is a little bit skewed, and then there'll be people who are fallen into the gaps, like Lorenzo's mentioning. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a brilliant idea, and it's actually something that we would love to campaign for. The big issue really is that student housing is a big business. Okay, maybe, can you see my screen now?
Yes, it's coming up.
Yes. Let's see if this works. You should be seeing,
here we are.
You see a map of Germany just now.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so that's my slides, or my mind map, really. Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna move to Edinburgh Student Housing Coop just to start. But yeah, no, you're totally right. I think there's a couple of big issues that prevent us basically from starting that campaign. the main one is student housing is big business. We have an unfortunate number of huge venture capitalists and investment funds that pump lots of money in student housing, and because it's just so profitable. We're actually, as Edinburgh Student Housing Coop, we have some. We're doing a campaign with the Scottish Government, so we're working for the cross-party group Cohousing, trying to write a report on student homelessness, and we're definitely going to try to push them in the direction of including more cohousing as a way to, deal with affordability problems. But we're also fighting. It's a bit of an uphill battle, to be honest, because the universities, which should be the big promoters of this more, holistic way to house students, don't really believe in our model, and they really like the control they get out of managing accommodations or giving them to organizations that are very professionalized in doing that. So yeah, we do need to build a little bit of trust and allies. Actually, that maybe leads me quite nicely to, let me see, should I go into that? I'm gonna go talk a little bit about this example in Germany, because I think this is a very successful model that I would like us to try to replicate. So Radical Roots is great. This is the map of houses that they have across the UK. They do seem to focus mostly on smaller co-ops, which I think that's fine, and it's actually quite an easy way to start a property, and there's this kind of conversion element of it, where the way I'm thinking about this is we don't necessarily want to self-build, because that's just going to take too much time, and you're going to lose people on the way, especially if we're thinking about this pipeline of people graduating and trying to move somewhere quite soon. So having a small home is definitely a good way to do it, and I think there is an element of if you start small, buy the house, get some loan from Radical Roots, slowly pay off your mortgage. That's then going to build up this kind of cooperative stock, and you can use the kind of equity, as Radical Roots is doing, to help finance other projects. But it's a slightly longer term thing. I mean, Radical Roots hasn't really funded a new house in quite a few years. There's a couple of properties where they've agreed to loan money in the next few in the next cycle, and so there's a few co-ops I know that are looking for a property just now, but it is quite a slow moving process. So on the opposite end in the UK, we have this new group called Roost Homes, and I think Roost kind of starts from this startup idea where they did start as an app or something where they wanted to facilitate house sharing, but then at some point they decided to pivot into co-ops. And so the way their model works just now is that they have a very centralized approach where they do buy properties, and then they kind of open up this waiting list almost of if I have a property, who's going to move, you can sign up here, and you can sign up as a group or as an individual. And once we've found a property that's, suitable, we'll just rent it for you. So you do form a co-op among the members to actually rent from this parent organization. And in a way, so these are two different approaches. I think these are very radical different views of how to do things. You can have this radical grassroots way to do things, or you can have the more institutional Roost rent, centralized model. And I think it can be both effective, just in different ways, and there's a slightly different value thing. So moving onto Germany, I quite like this. So if people aren't familiar with this, there's this group in Germany that's called the Mietshäuser Syndicate, the Tenement Housing Syndicate. And basically what this group has done over the last 30 years or so, they've actually managed to finance almost 200 projects, where by projects they mean any kind of like co-housing space. Some of them are co-op, some of them are different models. But it's quite an interesting, I'm not going to go through the whole graph necessarily, but basically the way that the system works is that you have the central syndicate, which is actually, so all the houses that all these co-ops live in are owned by the syndicate. And the reason why they're doing that is to prevent this phenomenon of that was actually happening there quite a lot, where people would obtain, housing stock to be run as a co-op for quite cheap, and then basically sell it as a profit after all the members have spent a lot of effort in renovating it. So the idea of the syndicate is quite a radical. We want to actually remove properties from the housing market, and basically they're kind of like locked in this ownership model where a property can only be sold if all of the other co-ops that live in these properties agree to sell. And so having this huge stock of properties has actually enabled them to develop a very quick fire funding model. So projects can actually get funded really quickly under this model because they do have a lot of capital that comes from the fact that they own houses. And so I only saw this today, but actually a large number of projects were actually started in the last 10 years. So this has proven to be a really, really successful model. And I think we need to actually learn a lot of lessons here and actually talk to people in there to figure out how do we replicate this here. Yeah, it is a matter of like critical mass to some extent. After you have enough people coming together, though I believe that these things would actually almost, it's not automatic. It always takes hard work. But, as we've seen, in the last 10 years, these things have ballooned quite quickly. So there's probably quite a big opportunity here to think about how we replicate this in the UK. And, the other thing that I think is significant here is we need to think about whether this UK-wide models work for us, or whether we need to have things that are specific to Scotland. I haven't really, I don't know if people here have interacted more with other co-housing or co-op groups across Scotland, but I've found that, a lot of those efforts of these other groups are really focused on England for obvious reasons. And a lot of the, legal advice doesn't necessarily translate to us. So maybe we need a group that's a bit, more focused on adopting the model to Scotland. We're obviously having conversations with our neighbours, but the reality is a little bit different. Yeah, so I guess there's some figures here from Co-op UK on like how many co-ops we have in Scotland, and that's kind of what I was talking about. We have the institutional side, the Federation of Housing Associations, which has the more, housing association-y type of co-ops, and then we have the Diggers and Dreamers type of co-housing / co-ops. I'm using these terms slightly interchangeably just now, but obviously, yeah, I mean, I think the co-ops I'm interested in are the more co-housing type of co-ops. A couple of things I also wanted to mention is that, we're actually not doing really well. So in the last few years, we've had a few, this is 2 cases from, I think, 2020, 2021, where we've actually lost a couple of housing co-ops. And, this is on the left side here. This is Hunter's Hall here in Edinburgh, which actually voted to be acquired by Hillcrest, which is a housing association. And I think, I don't have a lot of visibility in why this happened, but obviously housing associations in Scotland are really centralizing And so there's definitely lots of advantages that come from this kind of economy of scale that you get from having a big institution. And I guess to some extent, we are seeing that maybe the economic incentives are not so good to keep your independence. And then on the other side, other bad, things that have gone wrong. This housing co-op, also in Edinburgh, a few years ago, basically there's some interpersonal drama, and it was a bit before I was really involved, so I wasn't really aware what was going on at the time. But basically, one or two members of the co-op managed to sell the house for £1 million by, essentially kicking everyone else out. And we didn't really have. I know that co-ops in Edinburgh and outside Edinburgh tried to facilitate, conflict resolution within the co-op to stop this from happening, but we didn't really have enough of a safety net, let's say, between the co-ops to actually stop this, and the institutions, the FCA, didn't really do anything about it. So this is kind of like a good reason why we need something like the tenant syndicate in Germany, where we actually stop things from this, like stop things like this from happening. Slightly happier news from this year. I'm sorry, this is quite tiny, so you probably won't be able to read it. But one of the smaller housing association, there was didn't call itself a co-op, but it did have a layer of tenant management. They actually voted against being acquired from one of the larger housing associations in the country. So I think this was really reassuring news, because it shows me that there's still appetite, even within the social side of tenancies, to actually stay smaller and more independent. So but we need to make sure that we get more of these cases on the left and less of these cases on the right. And to some extent, we have to do this by building more mutual support between different groups. Okay, this is very it's me a bit rambly, but I guess the next thing that I think we can talk about is, as I've said, I kind of break this down into lots of different categories, or really two different things: money on one side and land. These are the big problems that we have to face. But there's also a people problem to some extent. So one thing that I think we've kind of touched a little bit upon to some extent is I really like this chart that I found it a few days ago. It's basically, it comes kind of from a background, I think, of people campaigning for social change. And basically it's this kind of cycle of how do you divide people in relationship to your group? And it can go from people that are actually, helping you to organize, to people that are working against you. And basically this theory of social change says that when you're trying to build a movement, you kind of want people to to move from right to left, one step at a time. So whenever you're having a conversation with someone who might be neutral or an opponent, you kind of want them to move to a passive supporter, or from a passive opponent to someone that's neutral, or even better, supporting. So this is kind of like a thing that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of the other side of this, which is politicians. My favorite topic.
Lorenzo, just before you go on to that next thing, if you wrap up on this last point, and then we'll open the conversation, and then you can probably come back to your mind map to illustrate discussions. But we can then get some contributions from the floor. But
sounds good. Yeah, sorry, I've also not been looking at the chat because I was looking at my slides.
So what about this point here that you are going to make?
Yes. So very quickly, I think we do have I'm not going to talk about the logistics of the mind map as itself. It's just a lot of scattered thoughts that I'm trying to link together. But the two main points are political parties. We actually have, I think, a lot to sell to most of the parties, even the ones that you might not think would be interested in these things actually are. I think the concept of like co-ops is really appealing to all political sides because of its various properties. So in a way, politicians are quite easy to sell this to. The bigger problem is the, you know, as people might have experienced, the civil servants and council officers. So we have to do this, you know, it's a two-phase thing where, you know, we can convince people of our political persuasion that, yes, this is a model that's worth developing, but we also need to convince the technical stuff that, you know, this is feasible, it's doable. We have like proven that it works by actually having lots of, you know, groups that have done this for years and years. And so, yeah, basically convincing them that this is feasible. And if we only can get help with like getting rid of some of this stuff, then we can actually deliver these things much more efficiently than the housing market does. And so I guess it's a slight call of action. Edinburgh City Council has now declared a housing emergency. And some of our work with the Green Party was basically to get them to include cooperatives in their action plans, which is great, but it's a very vague statement. It just says we shall explore co-ops as a you know, as an alternative. So I guess basically what the next step that we need to have is, you know, getting them to commit to concrete action. Yeah. Okay. I'll shut up in a second, but final call of action, kind of trying to summarize things a little bit. Where is the next thing we can do for like developing more co-ops? There's two approaches really. We can have this like more bootstrapped radical route kind of model, or we can have the more institutional model. And you know, I have a few ideas of how these things can keep going, but really the main takeaway I want to have is we need this kind of having a readiness directory, which is basically having groups of people that are, you know, interested in like either living or funding co-ops in a very democratic way, and facilitate conversation for people to come in together, collecting, you know, putting together their money, figuring out business models, and when there is a property that's going on the market, being, you know, much more ready and reactive in getting there. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now and take questions or discussion points, I guess.
So if you press the red button at the bottom, stop sharing, and then we can.
Yeah.
And then
I will share the link to the mind map. I think it's read only. I didn't quite figure out how to make it collaborative, but if people want to look into some of the more, it's not super polished because I've only started working on this a couple of days ago, but I think it's got some interesting links, and you know, I'm trying to just make some connections. And if people have any comments and feedback, I would love to hear from you, even if it's after this conversation.
Oh, then friends, first of all, has anybody any comments? We've had some very interesting and useful comments in as we went along. Does anybody want to respond to the provocation that Lorenzo has shared?
Yes, I think it's very important that when it comes down to it, is what legal entity that owns the properties that will make the decision what happens to them. You know, so and I encourage everyone to look at the model that I'm proposing, which is using the Community Benefit Society as a legal entity to own the properties. So that from the start, that it means that we'll set up a legal entity that has a locked-in article of association, that you have a locked-in agenda, how the housing should be provided, and that's locked in, okay? And then using that entity to issue community shares, to invite investors to invest, to raise the capital to buy the properties. Then you have the full control of these properties to do what you're supposed to do for perpetuity without changing, you know. And then you rent. Basically, it looks like a very simple buy-to-let model. So you have this entity acquire properties, rent to tenants using normal residential lease, very normal lease, And as a tenant have spare cash, they can gradually buy shares one by one into their homes. So the renters become investors as well. So the renters become partners with the capital investors. Okay, so it becomes a collaboration between the landlord and the tenant. So that's something for I encourage everyone to have a look at and to think about. And I'll post the links to the models in the chat, and I welcome you to have a look at them. And I welcome any feedback. If you're interested, we can talk about it further.
Any other observations that in response to Lorenzo's presentation? Ali.
Hello, so I was struggling to find out how to put my hand up on this. So I'm just going to put my hand up like that. I actually had a question for Richard, and I was wondering whether Richard was talking about something that was like the German system that Lorenzo had described. In between what you were saying, capital investors, Richard, I wondered whether the people who are investing capital, whether they're taking a dividend. Because as soon as people are making profits off someone's rent, it's not co-housing. It's part of the problem.
Yes.
It's part of the cycle of wealth inequality that we've got ourselves into, that we're actually trying to get out of by having co-housing.
I understand. Well, community shares is a FCA regulated share system, and community shares is regarded as an ethical investment, and the annual return is restricted to up to 5% per year. So any investors invest into a project, they can only expect up to 5%. So that's quite ethical. It's not overly high. We're not talking about 10, 20% of return. So I think that is acceptable.
And would that be linked to the cost of living index? So for example, the cost of living has gone up about 25% over the past 4 or 5 years. If you were to invest money into something like that, and there was a 5%, would it, is there a way of making sure that you're at least getting that your money isn't depreciating? Or do you think that will not, perhaps people wouldn't mind about that because they know that they're doing something good for the community?
Certainly 5% is similar to how you get from a government bond, or so it's not for everyone. It's for people who have spare cash, who has spare cash and who are willing to support this type of ethical project. The important thing is that the investors would know that the money that invested into the scheme, the purpose will always remain the same. It's not going to change. I think this scheme is similar to what Lorenzo is talking about with the in the German the syndicates that holds all the properties, and they make sure that properties are used for the purpose they're intended to. And I think it's a very similar ideal to that. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, Richard. Yeah, I think to some extent it is similar. The main difference is, from my understanding, the syndicate, most of the people that hold the shares are people that live in the other houses. They do have a small number of outside investors, but it seemed to be concentrated in residents. So I'm not entirely sure how your model compares to that. We do have something similar in the UK that we've kind of been working on from the student side. So there's an organization called Student Co-op Homes. They're basically trying to bring together, investors that want to make this ethical, use of their money, with students that are looking for acquiring houses and co-ops. And it has had some success. They finally bought Birmingham Student Housing Coop after 10 years. But it also has some disadvantages that I can get into if people want to discuss that. But, you know, in a way, I don't think it's a very effective organization from this point of view of speed and agility that I kind of like really thinking about. I also wanted to respond to one of the messages in the chat. There is no institutional support for housing co-ops in Scotland at the moment. I was really disappointed to find out that Cooperative Development Scotland is not interested in supporting people with starting housing co-ops. They tried to redirect me to the SFHA, but obviously they're also not interested in non-registered social landlord co-ops. So we do have a gap. And I'm trying to work with some MSPs to think about whether we could develop an institution from government that could try to provide this institutional support. Yeah.
Anybody else? Kat, do chip in.
No, I just wanted to say so much interesting stuff, Lorenzo, but I like your idea near the beginning about co-op readiness, and that just rings so true for the co-housing. You know, for Co-housing Scotland, what we're talking about all the time is trying to get groups to that stage of being ready so that we can take advantage of land or any opportunities. You know, there's so many people who are interested, but I think we need to have the groups forming and doing all that initial work of getting to know each other. What kind of community do they want? Yeah, so that we're not just individuals. That's all.
Yeah, thanks, Cap. I think I absolutely agree, and this is why I'm having this presentation. I don't come with answers, sadly. I wish I did, but yeah, I think the mind map for me was a useful start to think about where, you know, how do we form these connections, and to some extent, I think it has to be geographical, obviously. Not that people might, you know, I think people might even want to move to different parts of the country if there is a nice co-housing opportunity there. But we do have to start with like people that are located in specific areas. And when it comes to like, you know, dense places like Edinburgh and Glasgow or other cities, you know, there will be more people that are interested than we can fit in properties. So we need to develop a little bit of a system of like figuring out how to bring people together and form these groups. Is it maybe based on, you know, demographics like people in Lenzi are doing, or is it based on some kind of like shared interests, shared values? Yeah, and so maybe there's a space for Cohousing Scotland or another organization helping facilitate these conversations somehow.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll come to Tom in a minute. We've got about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes maximum before we close up. So if anybody else wants to bring any points to the table, just start thinking of them, and like Tom, put your hand up. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks. I think Nori had his hand up first, but I'll dip in first and then hand over to Nori if that's okay. Just say, yeah, Lorenzo, love the talk. I think you've been, you know, addressing a lot of the same challenges that Cohousing Scotland has and our groups have, but maybe from a slightly different starting point and identifying, you know, perhaps different approaches or opportunities. I'm just wondering about this opportunity we have at the Scottish Parliament in January and whether we might collaborate on that, because it seems to me you've identified maybe some specific technical and non-technical barriers and are suggesting changes that could be implemented if we had Scottish Government approval. And in the context of Housing to 2040, you know, supporting in principle co and cooperative housing, I think it would be good to bring those two narratives together in as specific a way as we can about changes that need to happen to kind of unlock this process and to try and target what we get out of that opportunity, and, you know, inviting specific MSPs who have an interest, not just your geographic interest, but an interest in housing, and maybe also in the position of students and other, you know, non-advantaged groups in terms of the housing market, and that we could sort of develop our messaging on that together. That was my point, really, but just to say, yeah, thanks for that. Nori, maybe hand over.
Over to Nori, and then Ceci and Ali.
Yeah, I agree with Tom's point there about how we take a strategy going forward, because it strikes me we're in a bit of a catch-22 situation here, Lorenzo. The reality is any property in Edinburgh or Glasgow or any of the main cities, any potential site or any potential cooperative or co-housing group is going to be up against the big hitters. So the likelihood is, unless you have an ethical backer, which in this very capitalistic property-minded society we're in is a rare commodity, or we can set up a community benefit society that would have to have funding behind it to put us in that position, we're going to struggle. And it's how do we break this vicious circle that we're in at the moment. And you were talking about small cooperatives, small housing cooperatives and the likes. The reality is, and I think this is something we tend to forget, is that to manage a property, the size of the one that you're living in at the Edinburgh Student Housing Cooperative or the other ones that have already gone, the reality is you need somebody with the expertise, probably paid, to manage the asset over the period of time, the factoring factor, if you like. And that's a reality. You can't get away from it. You have to have funds to upgrade the building or to maintain it, and you have to have somebody with the expertise to do that. But anyway, I'll go back to what Tom said there about how we move forward is going to be the problem here, because at the moment, until we have the support of the government or certain politicians and maybe some backing in principle, let alone in terms of money, we're all struggling here. Thank you.
Ceci. Unmute. Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering, because I mean I'm really not aware of the legal differences between Scotland and England. And I think I'd like to learn more about that. But in terms of kind of getting across the idea of how being part of co-op feels like, because I think there is a lot to say about that, and about kind of getting people to think about equal sharing and like shared ownership and all those kind of things. I was wondering if, you know, is there any way to connect? I'm sure there are like food share, like food cooperatives, so like kind of take an area of people's life that's still very kind of basic and very fundamental to their life, but that's maybe is less kind of linked in with very complicated and specific like piece of legislation. And actually, I mean, I'm thinking, you know, where I live in my block of flats, like in a block of flats, actually people kind of saying we buy our food cooperatively. We do that in a shared way. And it's a small step towards actually having a real lived experience of this that may then be useful. So I don't know if, again, because I don't know Scotland very well, if there, you know, if there are such networks that are existing in Scotland. I'm sure there are, and actually where, you know, connections could be made there.
I think that's a good point. Cooperation breeds cooperation. And as I said, it's the sixth principle. Ali.
Hello there. Cecile, yeah, we've started, I've started looking for this. It was something that I thought didn't exist. And the more I look for it, the more I start seeing it. So there, I guess there already are groups that are starting to work on this. But it's a sort of thing where people need to be drawn in. So I'm just in my own neighborhood, I'm starting to see people who are getting more and more cooperative on, like we have a community-owned building that's being developed just around the corner from me, and there's a community orchard that we're working on. So there is stuff that's happening. I agree. The main reason why I put my hand up was I wanted to just put a question and frame the problem that Lorenzo has in terms of my own situation. And my own situation is that I have as I said, we've got like essentially like a 3-person co-op in a way, that we've got one person who is not very active, but not putting a lot of money in. There's me, who is active in management, and I'm putting the majority of the money in on a monthly basis. And then the person who's less active in the management, but who put up a really big amount of money up front, and is less able because of a disability. So there's this problem is in that if you are putting a lot of your capital up front, you want to have some sort of you need to know that your capital is safe and that there is sufficient management to that your investment is safe. So there's a number of ways of doing this, and like one of them was mentioned before, sort of alluded to, that you would need a factor or someone external. So if you have the person who's doing the management of the property who is not living in the property, or if the whole thing is when it's set up, you have people who are not living in the property doing the setting up, it's a very different thing that you have to if it's someone who's actually based there. So it's worth having a think about what you actually want, because the outcome will be quite different. And there might be situations where, and I'm not saying like one is better or the other. It's almost like they have very opposite different flavors. It might be possible to get an external person who is really, really competent and has a huge amount of experience, but because they're not living with it, they're in there, they may have different values, and they may not get all of the social nuances and stuff. And then if you've got someone who's living in the place, then it's a bit of a lottery, of whether you get a person or a group of people who are able to do the work and able to kind of respond quickly. So for me, that was like the key thing, is that this is a problem where it's a large amount of money that you're asking people to put in, and that money, you're then putting that money, which could be your own house. So in Choice, we were asking people to sell their own homes and lump it all together. And that would work if that money, that those people's retirement money, was then safe. So there was a lot of trust there that together, that collectively we were going to do that. And it's kind of difficult to make that decision, and it's difficult to know whether there is that group competence. So anyway, I'm not saying that there's an answer here. I'm just saying, for me, that's a fundamental question. That's, for me, is like the difficulty in my head of how would I scale up from a 2-person thing? From a 2-person thing, kind of easy if you've got that right balance of someone has money, someone has the time to manage it. But on a bigger scale, I can see that is a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed. And one of the things that you were suggesting of that German model, you can see that that's one particular way of addressing it. But I just wanted to add that as what I think the core problem is.
David, can I try to give a few answers? Yeah, thanks everyone. That was a really lots of interesting points. I think, to some extent, I think what Cecile and Ali were saying is very linked. I think it's all about the networks. We have tried to do a little bit of that work in Edinburgh to build a bit more of a inter-cooperative network, but it's very, very difficult. Like, we've been trying to put up regular meetups in our basement once a month, and people were a bit very quite excited at the start, but then the energy wanes. I think if there's not really a concrete project you're working with together, there's a risk that co-ops get a bit introspective, and they kind of lose sight of this big there is a movement and this 6 principle that actually we should be working together towards shared goals. I really think, I can imagine how hard it is to run a 3-person co-op if you're doing most of the work, Ali. But some of those things I think will come with scale. Where actually a factor, you know, if all the co-ops are hiring one factor to work on all of the properties, or, you know, if you can share responsibility, I call this the broad shoulder responsibility almost. That the thing that I find fascinating about co-ops is that you're not taking this risk on your own. You have this whole community, both inside your co-op and across the movement, where you can, like, you know, scale in this horizontal way where things kind of spread out over different institutions. And, you know, yeah, I think there is a lot of, you know, to some extent, I think we're not necessarily a good example, but the student housing co-op shows that you can get a lot of stuff done without expert advice. You know, we do have like our own internal maintenance teams that kind of like deal with most first response things that, you know, people can actually learn to fix on their own. And yes, some things we will need professionals, but because we can take care of like some of those, you know, low hanging fruits, that saves us a lot of money, and it's kind of what keeps some of these fees down. But yeah, I think, you know, in terms of what the whole policy and strategy that Tom and Nori were talking about, I think maybe we have well, to be frank, government is in chaos just now. We maybe have a new first minister now, but it's kind of like, it's kind of early days, and we can't really say how losing the Greens from the coalition is gonna change the cards. So I think there is a bit of an opportunity potentially where the housing bill that's going through Parliament just now, that's gonna go for a second phase, and maybe that now that Patrick Harvey is no longer a minister, rent controls are probably gonna get on the chopping block. So there is a potential for maybe introducing this more, you know, co-housing cooperative model as an alternative. But yeah. But yeah, so we'd be really happy to work with Cohousing Scotland people on like coming up with the two approach. Yeah.
So this evening, I've been really heartened by the interest shown in different forms, different approaches to intentional communities. It's just really heartening. Really heartening that there's a core team of people who are interested in these things, and certainly we'll need each other if there is to be the changes that Lorenzo's talking about, that Richard's talking about, and so on. I will sum up a little bit in mentioning some of the ways that we've thought to respond to Ali's point of safeguarding and achieving a middle way between social housing, which is supported by the state for rent, for those who are unable or have got challenges, and private housing for profit, and the whole profit thing. That this middle way could be exemplified by Your Space, which has established a community land trust, and similar to Richard's Community Benefit Society, and then to own the land, and then Lowfield Green in York to operate as the Mutual Home Ownership Society, which enables the participants in the cooperative, the buildings owned by a single entity, a cooperative. Cheers, Nori. To have a way of buying units in and contributing into the financing of the thing in a way that you can take it out if you're needing to move to another job. So for us, that's still in many ways the model. The challenge is that both community land trusts and community benefit societies need a geographic, defined community of interest. Community, and we face this chicken and egg between the land, the scarce resource, which is chased after, and and the human dimension. My friend Andy Swales always says you have to build the community before you can build a co-housing organization. So lots and lots of thoughts there, and so on. What I'll do is I'll share those thanks, Kath. That's a very good point, and I think it may be that that's one of the ways that that your space is going to have to go forward, and so on. What I'll do is I'll put the mind map in the next co-housing newsletter, e-news, and thank you all very much. That's my checkout. Anybody else got any comments as we go around? Tom, first, and to check out, to say farewell.
No, just that was fascinating and really good to make contact with Lorenzo. And yeah, let's keep on this path together. Yeah, great one.
Kath, just briefly.
Yeah, just exactly the same as Tom, really. It's really good to see Lorenzo after exchanging emails for a while. And I think we should try and do some work together. Yeah, I mean, we've got to have more strengths together, haven't we, than doing things separately.
And Richard, thank you for coming. Any comments from yourself as a checkout?
Yes, it's really interesting to hear Lorenzo's experience. Yeah, if you don't mind, Lorenzo, if I could send you an email, there's some questions I'd like to ask you. It would be good to keep talking to you.
Maybe pop your email in the chat, Lorenzo. Cecile, lovely to meet you. Welcome to Scotland.
Thank you. I hope to get to know some of you and the project you're doing.
Margaret, you've got a project a little further west from Falkirk. How are you doing? You need to unmute.
It's great to meet up with Lorenzo again, and thank you very much for setting out for scoping out the landscape, which resonates with so many of us. And I echo what Kath is saying. We can only be stronger together, and I think it's great to have a range of across the generations and across the lives that people are leading as well. It's really great. Co-housing is a great place, a great meeting place for the generations. I really appreciate a fascinating talk from you tonight, Lorenzo, and I hope we'll meet again quite soon. Thank you.
Shannon, do you want to have any final say? Thank you for staying the course. Or Maria, if you want to make any comment. Okay, so let's wind up now. It's 9 o'clock, but thank you all for your contributions. It's been a genuine conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, David.